My name is Clara Monroe. I'm 34 years old, a financial analyst who worked my entire life to stand on my own 2 feet, and the older sister in a family that somehow always treated me like an afterthought. I've been excluded before, birthdays, holidays, even my own graduation, but nothing prepared me for the betrayal that happened on Halloween. Something inside me broke that night, and I knew I couldn't just stay silent any longer. If you're watching this, please hit the like button, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and sharing your own experiences helps remind people like me that we're not alone in carrying scars like these. Halloween fell heavy that year, the streets lit with jack-o'-lanterns and the air sharp with the scent of burning leaves. Children in costumes darted between houses, their laughter echoing under a harvest moon. From my apartment window, I could see flickers of orange light dancing across the glass, hear the muffled chorus of voices celebrating. But inside, my chest tightened as I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. I had just uncovered the truth. My sister had sold off my share of the family inheritance, the old mansion, the one relic of our past that meant anything. And she had done it in secret. The document sat open in front of me, the black and white proof that my name had been erased. The signature was hers alone, bold and final, declaring that what was once ours was now gone. Outside, the world was wrapped in costumes and candy, but for me the night collapsed into silence. It wasn't just a property she had sold. It was my place in the story of our family, cut away with the stroke of a pen. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of betrayal pressing into my bones. The mansion wasn't just a house, it was where generations before us had lived, where legends of our bloodline were whispered like ghost stories, where every Halloween carried a strange, haunting glow. And now it was gone. Not to strangers, but taken from me by the one person who should have been my ally. As the clock pushed past midnight, I told myself the truth I had been avoiding all my life. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't a mistake. My sister hadn't simply sold a house. She had carved me out of the family for good. And if she thought I would accept that quietly, she didn't know me at all. Halloween is when masks are worn, secrets spill into the shadows, and hidden things crawl to the surface. That night, I made a vow. If she wanted war, then I would bring it to her doorstep. And the battleground would be the mansion itself. The morning after Halloween felt heavier than most. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. But inside me, the discovery from the night before still echoed like an unending scream. My sister had sold the mansion, my inheritance, behind my back. No matter how many times I replayed the details in my mind, the outcome was the same. She had erased me, and the last piece of our family's story was gone. I couldn't sit still. Something inside me demanded proof beyond the cold lines of the document I had read. If the house was no longer mine, I needed to see it one last time. Not through photographs, not through numbers on a screen. I needed to stand before it, breathe in its air, and remember exactly what was taken from me. The drive to the mansion cut through winding roads littered with fallen leaves. The trees bowed over the asphalt like mourners, their branches stripped bare, their shadows long across the pavement. The closer I came, the colder the air seemed to grow, as though the house itself was exhaling against me. When I reached the iron gates, rusted and stiff from years of neglect, my chest tightened. They stood exactly as I remembered, tall, unforgiving, and heavy with secrets. Beyond them, the mansion loomed against the gray sky, its windows staring back like watchful eyes. Even from a distance, the house carried a presence, as if it knew I had returned, as if it remembered me just as clearly as I remembered it. I stepped through the gates, the crunch of gravel under my shoes echoing in the stillness. Each step forward brought a flood of memories. Halloween nights when the house had been alive with decorations and laughter, the air sharp with the smell of roasted pumpkin seeds and wood smoke. As children, we had dared each other to creep into the attic, convinced it was haunted. My grandmother had played along, spinning tales of spirits who roamed the halls, restless and unfinished. At the time, it had felt like a game. Now, those stories pressed against me with an entirely different weight. The front steps groaned under my weight as I climbed. The door, though shut tight, still bore the scratches of age, faint marks I remembered tracing with my fingers as a girl. I imagined my sister's signature again, bold on the papers, and felt a surge of anger. She hadn't just sold wood and stone. She had sold this, the history, the memories, the ghosts of everything we had once been. I walked the perimeter slowly, peering through windows clouded with dust. The rooms inside were dark and empty, but I could still picture them vividly. The grand hall where portraits of long-dead relatives hung, their eyes following us no matter where we stood. The dining room where candles once glowed late into the night. The library with its crumbling shelves and scent of moth-eaten leather. Every glance through the glass felt like looking into a mirror of my own life. Fractured, abandoned, yet still stubbornly present. The house hadn't died. It was waiting. As I stood there, I couldn't shake the sensation that the mansion was more than a memory. It was alive. The creak of wood, the whisper of wind against broken shutters, even the way the branches clawed at the walls. It all felt deliberate, as if the house itself was speaking to me. Not begging to be forgotten, but demanding to be claimed. I pressed my palm against the cold glass of a window, my reflection faint against the shadowy interior. In that moment, I realized this wasn't the end. My sister might have sold the mansion, but I wasn't done with it. The house was still part of me, bound to me by something deeper than contracts or signatures. I turned back toward the gates, the chill of the air sinking into my bones. The betrayal had been real, the wound deep. But as I walked away, I carried with me not despair, but determination. If she thought I would let this go, she was wrong. The mansion wasn't lost. Not to me. Not yet. The drive back from the mansion was a blur, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that the tendons ached. Every streetlight I passed seemed to glare down at me like a witness, reminding me of the reality I could not escape. My sister had taken everything. She hadn't just sold the property. She had stripped me of a legacy, a history, and a claim to something I had always believed would one day be mine. By the time I reached my apartment, the anger had cooled into something sharper, something that felt less like grief and more like resolve. Revenge is a word people like to dismiss. Dramatic, petty, destructive. But sitting in the dim glow of my kitchen, I understood it differently. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about balance. My sister had tipped the scales, and I was going to even them. I pulled out the old family files I had kept tucked away in a fireproof box. Property records, tax documents, even faded photographs that told the story of who we were and what the mansion had once been. As I spread them across the table, a kind of clarity washed over me. Every paper, every signature, every faded date was proof that this house was more than a structure. It was blood and history. It was mine. I began with research. Hours slipped by as I traced ownership transfers, mortgage histories, and the debts my sister had quietly accumulated over the years. I discovered that selling the mansion hadn't been just a betrayal. It had been an escape. She had drowned herself in loans and credit cards, and unloading the house had been her way of buying temporary freedom. That realization ignited something deeper in me. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about her cowardice, her refusal to face the consequences of her own choices. By dawn, I had already drafted a plan. I would find out who had purchased the mansion, and I would buy it back, not with desperation, but with strength, proof that I was more capable than she had ever believed. I had worked my entire adult life building a career in real estate and investments. While she had squandered opportunities, I had saved, invested, doubled, and tripled my earnings. If the mansion had been sold to some wealthy opportunist, then I would match them, outbid them, outlast them. But even as I plotted, another thought lingered, dark and insistent. It wasn't enough to reclaim the mansion. If I wanted to make her understand the pain she had inflicted, she needed to feel what I had felt. Powerless, erased, and left standing outside the gates of her own story. I didn't just want the house back. I wanted her to know that she could never set foot in it again. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of obsession. My mornings were spent at work, my afternoons chasing paper trails, and my nights hunched over my laptop, combing through county records and real estate listings. Sleep became optional, food an afterthought. The deeper I dug, the more the fire inside me grew. There were moments, in the quiet hours of the night, when I caught myself wondering if I had gone too far. If maybe I should simply move on, let the past rot where it lay. But then the image would return. The iron gates, the dust-clouded windows, the sense of being cut out of something that should have been mine. And with it came the certainty that moving on was not an option. Revenge wasn't an accident. It was a choice. And I had made mine. I closed the files one night with trembling hands, exhaustion pulling at the edges of my body. But beneath it all, there was a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My sister had taken the mansion, but I was going to take it back. And when I did, I wouldn't just own the house. I would own the story. This wasn't grief anymore. This was war. The week after Halloween felt like it stretched into an eternity. Each day was consumed with work during the hours of light and research during the dark evenings that followed. My life had condensed into this cycle of obsession, every breath directed toward a single goal: the mansion. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was the embodiment of everything I had lost, and the only way I could imagine reclaiming myself was to reclaim it. It didn't take long to uncover who had purchased it. The name on the deed was a corporation, faceless, sterile, the kind of shell entity that hid the identity of its real owner. But I had navigated enough investment structures to see through the smoke. After days of digging, I found the truth buried in a subsidiary filing. The buyer was a private collector, someone known for acquiring old estates not as homes, but as trophies. That knowledge stung. The mansion hadn't just slipped into obscurity, it had been reduced to an object of pride for someone who had no connection to it. Yet the discovery only strengthened my resolve. If it had been flipped into the market, there was always a price tag attached. Everything could be bought for the right number. I told myself I was ready, that I had the financial weight to force this collector's hand, but deep down, there was something more complicated gnawing at me. The thought that chilled me wasn't about the money, it was about the mansion itself, because the more I studied, the more I realized how little I truly knew about what had been hidden within those walls. The archives hinted at it. Old newspaper clippings, brittle and yellowed, told stories of accidents on the property. A maid who had fallen from the top of the staircase under mysterious circumstances. A child who had disappeared one winter, last seen wandering near the cellar door. Even older than that were whispers of curses, of strange gatherings on the property during long autumn nights when the harvest moon burned red. Stories my grandparents used to dismiss as superstition now read differently in the glow of my laptop. The mansion's reputation was not just of grandeur. It was of something darker, something festering beneath its foundation. And now that my sister had cast me out of it, those stories clung to me like smoke. I drove past the house one night, unable to resist the pull. The gates were locked, but I parked on the roadside, my headlights cutting through the mist. The mansion loomed in the distance, its windows catching the faintest glow of the moon. It looked empty, abandoned even, but there was a heaviness to it, as if the house itself were watching me. I remembered Halloweens spent on that property as a child, when shadows stretched longer than seemed natural, and the wind carried whispers that no one else seemed to hear. Standing there, I realized the mansion wasn't just a symbol of betrayal, it was something else entirely, a place that had always demanded attention, always pulled at whoever laid eyes on it. Perhaps that was why my sister had sold it so quickly. Perhaps she had felt the weight too, but fear was a luxury I could no longer afford. I told myself I was stronger now, that my life had hardened me against superstition. The house could not scare me out of reclaiming what was mine. If anything, the secrets woven into its history only deepened my obsession. I didn't just want to own it, I wanted to master it. When I returned home that night, I made the call that would set everything in motion. My broker, my attorney, the people who knew how to navigate deals with collectors like this, I told them I was ready to pursue the property. I didn't care about the cost. I would stretch every resource I had to bring the mansion back under my name. Still, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of the windows glowing faintly against the fog. The silence of the house wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. And though I told myself that reclaiming the mansion would heal me, another thought pressed its way into my mind like a cold draft under a locked door. What if the house itself didn't want to be reclaimed? The offer went out faster than I expected. My team of advisors, though skeptical of my obsession, did what I asked. The number I sent was not just high, it was impossible to ignore. $7 million, wired and ready, attached with the condition of immediate transfer. It was a reckless bid, far above the fair market value. But I didn't care. This wasn't about rationality anymore. It was about taking back what had been stolen from me. When the acceptance came through, I felt a rush unlike anything I had ever known. The mansion, the very place my sister had tried to erase me from, was now mine. I owned it outright, free of her betrayal, free of her manipulations. The deed carried only one name: mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had clawed back a piece of my identity. But even as the victory pulsed through me, there was an unease I couldn't quite shake. Buying the house had been easy. Too easy. I had expected a fight, negotiations, pushback. Instead, the collector had accepted within hours, as though they had been waiting for someone, anyone, to take the burden off their hands. The first time I set foot inside as the new owner, I tried to let pride drown out the fear. The gates creaked open under the weight of years, the iron cold beneath my palm. The mansion rose up before me, vast and silent, its windows like unblinking eyes. The air carried the smell of dust and something faintly metallic, as though the house itself had been bleeding in my absence. Inside, the silence was suffocating. My footsteps echoed against marble floors that seemed too wide, too empty. The chandeliers above were cloaked in cobwebs, their crystals dull with neglect. Every corner carried the sense of abandonment, but not the kind that comes from time. It felt deliberate, as if the house had been vacated in haste, left behind without ceremony. I walked from room to room, forcing myself to catalog what was mine now. The grand staircase curved upward like a spine, each step groaning under my weight. The library still smelled faintly of old paper and ink, though the shelves were half bare. The ballroom, once the centerpiece of our family gatherings, stood hollow, its windows streaked with grime. It was all mine, yet it didn't feel like it belonged to me. I told myself the unease was just nostalgia, the ghosts of memory clinging to every surface. But as I moved deeper into the house, a different sensation began to take hold. It wasn't just memory that lingered here. It was presence, a heaviness that pressed against my chest, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Still, I forced myself to move forward. Ownership was power, I repeated in my mind. My sister had cast me out, but now I had returned stronger than ever. This house would no longer be a symbol of loss. It would be my triumph, my proof that she could never erase me. The papers were signed, the money was gone, and the house was mine. Yet as the sun began to set behind the hills, filling the halls with shadows that stretched too far, the weight of what I had done began to settle in. I had not simply bought back a piece of property. I had tied myself to it in a way I didn't fully understand. That night, as I lay in one of the upstairs bedrooms, the same room that had been mine as a child, the house creaked and groaned like a living thing. The wind pressed against the windows, carrying with it whispers I couldn't place. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of doors closing in distant corridors. Footsteps that didn't belong to me. I told myself it was the settling of an old structure, the noises of age. But beneath that rationalization, something darker stirred. I woke before dawn, drenched in cold sweat, convinced I had heard someone standing at the end of my bed. The room was empty, but the feeling clung to me, an invisible hand tightening around my throat. I sat upright until the first pale light of morning broke through the curtains, refusing to close my eyes again. The mansion was mine. That was undeniable. But as I walked its halls the next morning, I began to understand a truth that unsettled me. Ownership did not equal control. My sister had betrayed me, yes. But maybe, just maybe, she had also rid herself of something she had never dared name aloud. And now, for $7 million, I had bought not just a house, but every shadow, every secret, every weight it carried. And in the stillness of those empty halls, I wondered if I had been victorious, or if I had walked willingly into a trap that had been waiting for me all along. The second night in the mansion was heavier than the first. The novelty of ownership had dulled, and what remained was a gnawing unease I couldn't rationalize away. I told myself that restoring the house would erase the shadows. Fresh paint, cleaned chandeliers, laughter echoing through the halls again. Surely that would return it to its former glory. But as darkness settled over the estate, the air thickened into something far less forgiving. The house was alive. That was the only way I could describe it. Every board seemed to sigh beneath my weight. Every wall seemed to lean closer as though listening. I could feel it most acutely in the great hall, where the high ceilings and long windows should have offered freedom but instead pressed down like a cage. Even the silence was unnatural. Not empty, but watchful, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I tried to distract myself with work, spreading documents across the dining table, tracing the mansion's financial history again and again. But as the clock ticked past midnight, concentration dissolved into restlessness. My eyes wandered to the darkened corners, to the faint movement of shadows where none should have been. Once or twice, I caught the flicker of light in the mirrors, as though someone were standing just behind me. Each time, I turned to find nothing but my own reflection, pale and hollow-eyed. Sleep was impossible. When I finally forced myself into bed, exhaustion pulling at me, I was met with dreams that felt too real to dismiss. I dreamt of the staircase, but it was taller, endless, each step groaning louder the higher I climbed. I dreamt of doors opening on their own, revealing rooms filled with whispers, though I could never make out the words. And always, in the dreams, there was the sense of being followed, not chased, not threatened, just observed, as though something ancient and patient was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted tight around my body. The room was freezing, my breath hanging in the air even though the heating system was running. At the far corner, the curtains swayed gently, though the windows were locked. I sat upright, trembling, convinced that if I turned my head too quickly, I'd see someone standing in the shadows. The mansion wasn't simply old. It wasn't simply neglected. It was occupied, not by people, but by memory, by grief, by a weight that pressed itself into the very bones of the place, and now it had chosen me as its audience. Morning light brought no comfort. The house seemed almost smug in the daylight, its windows glowing softly, its halls basked in golden warmth. But I knew better. Beneath the veneer of safety, something waited. I walked the property that afternoon, trying to ground myself. The gardens were overgrown, the iron gates rusting, the fountains dry. It was easy to imagine the place as it once was, vibrant, alive, filled with parties and laughter. But every glimpse of beauty was shadowed by decay, and every corner seemed to carry echoes of something unfinished. By the time the sun sank again, I had made a decision. I couldn't keep pretending that this was just an ordinary house. If I wanted to survive here, I had to face what it truly was. This wasn't simply about revenge against my sister anymore. This was about reclaiming something darker, the truth that had been buried with the mansion for generations. As the first stars blinked into the sky, I stood in the great hall once more. The air felt heavier than before, charged like the silence before a storm. My reflection in the window looked back at me, weary and determined, as though daring me to continue. I whispered to myself, though the sound seemed swallowed by the walls, "The house is mine." But in that moment, I wasn't sure if I had claimed it, or if it had claimed me. The third night in the mansion pressed down heavier than the others, as if the house had been waiting for me to cross an invisible threshold. The whispers I had felt before became harder to dismiss. They weren't simply tricks of my imagination anymore. They had rhythm, a cadence, as though the walls themselves were reciting something ancient. All day I had tried to keep busy with practical tasks, unpacking boxes, dusting off furniture, sketching plans for renovations. But no matter how much I did, the house seemed to resist me. Layers of dust returned quicker than I could sweep them away, and the scent of damp wood clung to the air as though it had never left. I realized with a jolt of unease that I was not restoring this house. I was intruding on it. By late evening, my attention turned to the two spaces I had avoided since my return: the attic and the basement. Both had loomed in my memory since childhood, though I had rarely been allowed inside them. The attic was a place of forgotten trunks and broken furniture, where spiders nested in the rafters, and the air was thick with dust. The basement, however, was different. It carried a reputation in family whispers, a place we were warned never to enter alone, a place where locks rusted and light refused to linger. Something inside me insisted I could no longer avoid them. If the mansion was to belong to me, I had to confront every part of it, even the corners where fear had settled deepest. I started with the attic. The staircase was narrow, tucked behind a panel door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Dust rose with every step, swirling in the glow of my flashlight. When I pushed open the hatch, the smell of mildew and mothballs wrapped around me. The space was cluttered, exactly as I remembered. Stacks of trunks, cracked wooden chairs, portraits whose faces had faded into smudges of shadow. I wandered slowly, brushing dust from frames, lifting lids from old boxes. Most of it was harmless: yellowed letters, moth-eaten blankets, children's toys dulled by age. But one trunk sat apart, placed deliberately in the farthest corner. Its lock had long since rusted, but the lid opened easily under my hands. Inside, I found journals, dozens of them, their leather covers brittle, their pages filled with cramped handwriting. I sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the first. The entries belonged to my great-grandmother, written nearly a century ago. At first, they were simple accounts of daily life in the mansion, the endless tasks of running a household. But as the years progressed, the tone shifted. She wrote of strange occurrences: footsteps in the night when the house was empty, doors opening by themselves, reflections in mirrors that did not match her own. The final entries chilled me. They spoke of rituals performed in secret, of a pact made to keep the family strong, of sacrifices hidden in the cellar where no one was meant to look. I snapped the journal shut, my pulse hammering in my throat. Suddenly, the attic seemed to lean closer, the rafters groaning as if disturbed by my discovery. I shoved the journals back into the trunk and fled down the stairs, slamming the panel door behind me. But the words clung to me. A pact. A sacrifice. The basement was next. I had avoided it for years, but the weight of my great-grandmother's confessions left me no choice. If there were answers, they would be there. The door to the basement was hidden behind the kitchen, a heavy slab of wood reinforced with iron hinges. The lock was stiff but gave way under my hand. A wave of cold air spilled up the stairs, carrying the smell of damp stone and something else, something sharp, metallic, like rust or blood. I descended slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the black. The steps were uneven, carved from stone that had chipped and cracked over generations. At the bottom, the basement stretched wider than I expected, its walls lined with shelves of glass jars long emptied, their labels faded beyond recognition. Cobwebs clung to every surface, but beneath them, the stone glistened faintly with moisture. As I moved deeper, I found markings etched into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize, carved in patterns that spiraled and twisted. Some looked freshly cut, though I knew no one had been here for decades. My flashlight flickered, dimming for a moment before returning to full strength. In that brief darkness, I could have sworn I saw movement in the corner of the room, a shadow that didn't belong to me. At the center of the basement stood a stone slab, waist-high, its surface stained dark. I froze, realization crashing into me. This had been more than a cellar. This had been an altar. My great-grandmother's words returned with force. Sacrifices hidden in the cellar. The air grew heavier the longer I stared. It wasn't just the weight of history pressing against me. It was expectation, as though the house itself were waiting for me to continue what had been started generations before. My skin prickled, my throat tightened, and I stumbled backward, desperate to escape the gravity of that slab. I fled up the stairs, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But even as I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, I knew the truth. I couldn't unsee what I had found. The mansion was not haunted in the way stories suggested. It wasn't simply filled with restless spirits. It was bound to something older, something that demanded recognition, something that now considered me its keeper. In that moment, I realized my sister hadn't betrayed me by selling the house. She had freed herself from it. And I, blinded by revenge, had walked willingly into its grasp. Owning the mansion was supposed to feel like victory, a reclamation of power after years of being dismissed, excluded, and betrayed. But the longer I stayed within its walls, the more I understood that ownership here was not freedom. It was a binding. Every day that passed, the house tightened its grip on me, weaving itself into my thoughts, my body, my very sense of reality. At first, it was small. I would misplace items only to find them in places I hadn't been. My keys on the library shelf. My shoes left neatly by the basement door, though I swore I had dropped them in the entryway. Then came the nights, when sleep fractured into shards of terror. I would wake to the sound of footsteps pacing above me, even though the second floor was empty. Sometimes it was whispers, faint, melodic, almost like a lullaby that turned sour the longer I listened. The house demanded my attention. Each creak, each sigh of the walls, each flicker of the lights pulled me deeper into its rhythm, and I began to realize that the mansion didn't care about me as an individual. It didn't care about my revenge against my sister, or my pride in owning it. What it wanted was obedience. What it wanted was blood. I tried to leave once, just for a night. I packed a small bag, locked the front doors, and drove toward the city. But as the headlights swept over the gates, a cold dread filled me. It wasn't just reluctance. It was as though invisible chains coiled around my chest, tightening with every mile I tried to put between myself and the property. My hands trembled on the wheel, my breathing came shallow, and before I knew it, I was turning back. The relief that washed over me when I saw the mansion again was almost euphoric. I told myself I had forgotten something important, that it was practical to return. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house would not let me leave. Days bled into nights, and my reflection began to change. At first, I noticed it in my eyes. Darker, heavier, as though I hadn't slept in weeks. My skin grew pale, almost translucent, like the faded photographs of my ancestors that still lined the hallways. When I passed the mirrors, I avoided looking directly, because sometimes what stared back at me wasn't me at all. It was something older, something waiting behind the glass for me to acknowledge it. The journals from the attic haunted me. I read them again and again, searching for answers, but each passage led to the same truth. The mansion's strength was built on sacrifice. My great-grandmother had written of offerings made to ensure prosperity, to protect the family, to keep the land fertile and the legacy unbroken. It was a trade, simple and horrifying. Loyalty and blood for power and survival. And now, I was part of that bargain. The realization came slowly, but once it settled in me, it was impossible to ignore. My sister had not escaped by accident. She had seen this, perhaps even felt it, and chosen to cut herself free, even if it meant betraying me. Selling the mansion hadn't been greed. It had been desperation. And I, blinded by revenge, had stepped directly into the snare she had evaded. I tried to resist. I burned sage through the halls, opened every window to flood the rooms with light, even prayed quietly in the stillness of night. But none of it mattered. The house absorbed it all, smothering every attempt as though mocking me. Each act of defiance left me weaker, more frayed, until I no longer felt like a guest fighting against the walls, but a thread being rewoven into its fabric. The basement called to me most of all. Every time I passed the kitchen, the air grew colder near the door, tugging at me like a tide. I avoided it, but the pull was constant, gnawing at the edge of my mind. Some nights I dreamed of standing before the stone slab, my hands slick with blood I couldn't explain. Other nights I woke to find the basement door ajar, even though I had locked it myself. It became clear that the mansion didn't simply want me to stay. It wanted me to participate, to continue the rituals that had sustained it for generations. And though I recoiled at the thought, another part of me, the part already woven into its history, whispered that resisting was futile. That this was what it meant to be a Monroe, bound to this house, bound to its hunger. The victory I had imagined, standing triumphant, showing my sister that I had reclaimed everything, felt hollow now. What good was ownership if it came with chains I could not see but could feel tightening every hour? My sister had betrayed me, yes, but in her betrayal, she had survived. And I, in my triumph, was being consumed. On the 8th night, I stood once more in the great hall, staring at the reflection of myself in the tall windows. My outline shimmered faintly, as though I was no longer entirely solid. My breath fogged the glass, and in the faint mist I thought I saw another face overlapping mine, older, gaunt, with hollow eyes that belonged not to me but to the house. The price of ownership had revealed itself, and it was far greater than the $7 million I had paid. By the 9th night, resistance felt like an illusion. I had told myself that I was strong, that I could bend the mansion to my will, that my ownership meant authority. But the truth was undeniable. I no longer owned the mansion. It owned me. The pull toward the basement grew unbearable. Every time I passed the door, my body shivered with recognition, as though the wood itself called my name. I locked it, bolted it, even stacked furniture against it, but still I dreamed of descending those stairs. And when I woke, I would find the door open again, the locks twisted loose, the air cold with the scent of damp stone and iron. On the 9th night, I gave in. Not out of curiosity, not even out of courage, but because my body moved without my permission. My hands unbolted the door. My feet carried me down the narrow steps, and my flashlight trembled in my grip, though I barely felt it. The basement swallowed me whole, its darkness thicker than before, its silence louder. The slab stood at the center, unchanged but heavier somehow, as if it had been waiting for me. I approached slowly, my breath shallow, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. My flashlight flickered again, and in that momentary dimness, I thought I saw stains glisten across the stone, fresh, wet, though I knew no one else had been here. The journals had spoken of sacrifice, but standing there, the truth clarified itself in a way words never could. The house was not haunted by accident. It was fed. Generation after generation had carved their survival out of this bargain, giving pieces of themselves, sometimes livestock, sometimes blood, sometimes lives, in exchange for prosperity. The prosperity of my family, the legacy I had always envied in my sister, had been bought at this very altar. And now, I understood what it demanded of me. The air thickened, pressing against my chest until I could hardly breathe. My vision blurred, shapes flickering in the corners of the basement. Figures, faint as smoke, gathered along the walls, not people, but impressions of those who had come before me. Ancestors whose eyes glowed faintly, whose mouths moved in whispers I could not decipher but felt in my bones. They were not warning me, they were beckoning. My legs shook as I braced myself against the slab. The surface was ice cold, slick with moisture that felt like more than water. I could feel the history beneath my palms. The blood, the fear, the offerings piled high across decades, and beneath it all, something deeper, darker, older than my family, older than the house, older than the ground itself. It wanted me. I tried to fight, clinging to the memory of why I had come here in the first place. My sister's betrayal, my fury, the victory of reclaiming what she had stolen. I recited it in my head like a prayer. But the mansion laughed at my defiance. I felt it in the way the stone vibrated beneath my hands, in the way the air pulsed like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. My vision darkened at the edges, and for a moment, I wasn't in the basement at all. I was seeing flashes of the house as it had been, grand parties spilling into midnight, chandeliers blazing, laughter echoing through the halls. Then the images shifted, screams, blood dripping down the staircase, figures bound to the slab while the walls drank their cries. It was all one history, all one truth. The prosperity had never been free. It had always been purchased in flesh. I gasped, stumbling back, but the basement seemed to close around me. The shadows pressed closer, the whispers rising to a chorus. My skin burned. My veins felt like they were carrying fire instead of blood. And in that moment, I understood. The mansion wasn't asking me to offer something. It was demanding me, bound by blood, not by choice. When I finally tore myself away from the slab and staggered up the stairs, I wasn't the same. My reflection in the glass panes of the kitchen door was thinner, paler, my eyes ringed with shadows too deep to be natural. I looked older, worn, as though the house had taken years from me in a single night. The mansion had always demanded sacrifice, and now it had begun with mine. The 10th night arrived with the weight of inevitability. By then, I no longer counted days the way I used to. Time inside the mansion had fractured, bending around the rhythm of the house itself. The clocks ticked, yes, but their hands seemed to spin differently, as though measuring not hours but the slow unraveling of my will. That day I had tried to fight back one last time. I called contractors, arranged for inspections, tried to speak of renovations as though they might ground me in normalcy. Yet every phone call dropped before it connected, every email vanished unsent. The world outside the mansion was slipping further away, its threads cut one by one. It wasn't technology failing me. It was the house tightening its grip. By evening, I understood. There would be no saving myself through ordinary means. The sun fell behind the hills, bleeding orange and red into the horizon, and the mansion sighed around me. The air cooled too quickly. The shadows stretched too long, and the lights dimmed though the power hadn't faltered. I lit candles in the great hall, their flames trembling against the draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The whispers began almost instantly, gathering like a chorus that knew this night would end differently. My body felt fragile, as though something had been hollowed out of me since my descent into the basement. My reflection confirmed it. Skin pale, eyes sunken, hands trembling with weakness. I was becoming part of the house, one heartbeat at a time. And somewhere deep within me, I understood that was always its intention. Ownership had never been about possession. It was about surrender. I wandered the halls, letting my hand trail along the wallpaper where patterns of ivy had faded to near invisibility. The walls seemed to pulse faintly under my fingertips, warm in places, cold in others. I whispered to myself that I still had control, but the words tasted empty. The mansion no longer needed my consent. It had already claimed me. Drawn without resistance, I returned to the basement. The air thickened with every step downward, as though the weight of centuries pressed against me. The stone slab waited, glistening faintly in the candlelight I carried. The carvings on the walls seemed sharper now, their spirals twisting like snakes, their grooves darker than mere shadow. My ancestors' journals had spoken of sacrifice, but what I saw now was something beyond ritual. This wasn't devotion. It was consumption. The whispers rose until they filled my skull, drowning every rational thought. Shapes emerged in the corners, the same spectral figures I had glimpsed before, only clearer now, more solid. Faces half recognizable, half rotted by time. They ringed the basement, their eyes burning faintly with the same hunger as the house itself. They were my family, bound eternally to this place, kept alive not by flesh, but by the blood spilled here. And then it struck me with brutal clarity. This was my inheritance. Not the mansion itself, not its wealth or grandeur, but its curse. My sister had not betrayed me. She had escaped me. By selling her share, she had broken her bond to this legacy, transferring the weight to me alone. I had mocked her cowardice, but now I envied it. She had known the truth all along, and I, blinded by revenge, had walked straight into the jaws of the house. The candle in my hand flickered violently and went out, leaving only the faint glow of the slab to light the room. My body moved without command, my palms pressing against the stone as though compelled. The surface pulsed under my touch, wet and warm like living skin. A shudder ran through me, followed by a searing pain that tore across my chest. It felt as though invisible hands were carving into me, binding me tighter with every breath. Images flooded my mind again, parties drenched in gold, fields ripe with harvest, families laughing in rooms filled with light. But beneath them ran the true cost: screams swallowed by stone, lives drained into the earth, children raised not as heirs but as offerings. Every moment of prosperity had been bought here, on this slab, by blood that cried out across generations. And now it was my turn. I collapsed forward, my cheek pressing against the cold stone, tears streaking down my face. The house didn't want me dead. Not yet. It wanted me diminished, hollowed, turned into part of its endless cycle. Every breath I exhaled felt stolen, absorbed into the walls. My heart thudded weakly, slower with each beat, until I could feel the rhythm aligning with the house itself. One pulse, one breath, one life feeding into the mansion's hunger. When I finally forced myself upright, the basement was empty. The figures had vanished, but their presence lingered in my bones. My hands were stained dark, though I had no wound to explain it. I stumbled back up the stairs, each step heavier than the last, until I collapsed into the great hall. The candles there burned steadily, mocking me with their fragile light. I looked into the tall mirror above the fireplace, and for the first time, I saw the truth. My reflection was not my own. The face staring back was older, hollow-eyed, gaunt. Not a stranger, but a blend of every ancestor who had come before me. Their features layered over mine, their presence grafted onto my body. I was no longer just Clara Monroe. I was the house. The mansion had claimed me completely. My revenge, my pride, my desperation to prove myself, all of it had been a mask to lure me here. Ownership was not victory. It was entrapment. And the price I had paid was not $7 million, but my soul. As the night deepened, I sat in the great hall, surrounded by flickering candles, the silence pressing down like a coffin. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the faintest echo of laughter, as though mocking my final defeat. The house was mine, but more importantly, I was its.